So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's town hall on CMS's proposal for coverage of aducanumab, marketed as Aduhelm. My name is Terrence Casey. I'm the Director of Communications for the Penn Memory Center. And today we're bringing together experts on Medicare and Alzheimer's disease to detail how we, or I guess more specifically, aducanumab got here today, what the CMS proposal means for PMC and for you, and what steps you could take. In just a moment, I'm going to turn the controls over to our speakers, Jason Karlawish and Alison Hoffman. But first, some housekeeping. This event is recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available. So I'll ask that you keep your mics and cameras muted for the duration of the event. You can feel free to submit questions at any time using the chat function here. And we'll save some time at the end for questions and answers. Coverage of this event and the recording will appear in this weekend's edition of Insight, the Penn Memory Center newsletter. And if you don't already subscribe to Insight, you can just drop your email address into the chat. We'll get you all set up and you'll get the first edition this coming Sunday morning. So with that, let's meet our panelists. Alison Hoffman is a professor of law at Penn. She's an expert on healthcare law and policy. Her work examines some of the most important legal and social issues of our time, including health insurance regulation, the Affordable Care Act, Medicare and retiree healthcare expenses, and long-term care. Her current projects evaluate the adoption of a public health insurance option for employer health plans, consider the future of long-term care and end-of-life care policies and regulation, especially in light of the impact of COVID-19, and critique how economic theory has overly shaped the development of health law and policy. She's also co-authoring a third edition of The Politics of Medicare with Theodore R. Marmer. Jason Karlawish, co-director of the Penn Memory Center, is a professor of medicine, medical ethics and health policy, and neurology. He researches and writes about issues at the intersections of bioethics, aging, and the neurosciences. He's written extensively about today's topic in both academic journals and also public media like Stat News and the Philadelphia Inquirer. And he's the author of The Problem of Alzheimer's, How Science, Culture, and Politics Turned a Rare Disease into a Crisis and What We Can Do About It. So thank you, Jason and Alison. I will turn it over to you two.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Oops, sorry about that. Let me slide back up. Good. All right. Well, good afternoon. Greetings and welcome to this community forum. I want to thank Terry Casey and the communications team for organizing this. And just to repeat, this is being recorded and it will be put up on the Penn Memory Center website for viewing. Again, the run of show here is that I'll give an overview of Aduhelm with attention to how aducanumab transformed into Aduhelm, that is to say the FDA approval on June 7th of 2021. And then I'll talk and overview how Aduhelm has unfolded in clinical practice, which will lead us up to the events of last week when Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services issued their proposal for how they will cover this drug. Next, Alison Hoffman will overview the Medicare Coverage with Evidence determination process. She'll talk about what the CMS is, what does it mean to be covered by Medicare, and in particular, the idea of coverage with evidence development and its implications. I'll return to talk about the specifics of the CMS proposal that was put out last week, overviewing those highlights of the proposal, the reactions that have happened to it, and the next steps. And then we'll have time for question and answer. We've allocated about an hour for this. So let's first begin with a review of how aducanumab became Aduhelm. This is a topic that for many is a review because, as you know, soon after the June 7th decision by the Food and Drug Administration to approve aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, we conducted a discussion, Dr. Wolk and myself. So some of this will be a review. So on July 8th of 2020, Biogen, the owner of the drug aducanumab, along with the company Eisai, but Biogen submitted a package of data to the Food and Drug Administration And their request to the Food and Drug Administration was to review the material and to give what was called standard approval. That is to say, Biogen, in its press release, said how they were asking the FDA to approve the drug as a safe and effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease, with emphasis that this would be, if so approved, would be the first treatment approved that targets a biomarker of the disease, namely amyloid, and that targeting the biomarker, they argued, translates into improvements in the clinical condition of patients. FDA accepted the package and granted it a process of a review that would unfold rapidly in light of the fact that it was an important drug for a disease that lacks any effective treatments at this point that target the pathology. Soon thereafter, in November, FDA presented and Biogen presented the case for standard approval to an advisory committee. FDA, at its discretion, will convene advisory committees, typically to answer a question, to hear that there are two sides to a problem, and they'd like the advisory committee to hear the two sides, ask questions, and then vote on those questions. And so on November 2020, an advisory committee met. And they were presented data from two identical phase 3 clinical trials named Engage and Emerge that had been conducted by Biogen. In addition, data from an earlier phase 1 study done by Biogen called the PRIME study, all that used the drug aducanumab in persons with either mild cognitive impairment or mild stage dementia, clinically thought to be caused by Alzheimer's, and who had then biomarker verification with a PET scan that they had elevated amyloid. It was an interesting advisory committee hearing insofar it was sort of a joint presentation by Food and Drug Administration and Biogen to make the case that there was exceptionally compelling evidence that the drug was safe and effective for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. The advisory committee did not see the case, did not agree, and they voted nearly unanimously that the evidence was not supporting approving the drug as safe and effective. In the ensuing months, FDA would extend the deadline for when they anticipated announcing a decision from January of 2021 to no later than June of 2021. And on June 7th of 2021, they issued their decision, and their decision was to approve aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And in their press release that day, they summarized their reasoning. And I'll just quote from the press release: patients who received the treatment, aducanumab, had significant dose and time-dependent reduction in amyloid beta plaque, while patients in the control arm of the studies had no reduction in amyloid beta plaque. These results support the accelerated approval of Aduhelm, which is based on the surrogate endpoint of reduction of amyloid beta plaque in the brain, a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease. So what FDA did was use a different set of regulations, a different set of guidance they have, which is what's called accelerated approval. Accelerated approval allows them to allow a company to sell a drug based on evidence that the drug has an effect on a surrogate, a measure of pathophysiology. And while that effect is very clearly established, as it is with aducanumab, the relationship between the change in the surrogate, in this case beta amyloid, and the health and well-being of patients, in this case people with mild cognitive impairment or mild stage dementia caused by Alzheimer's, has not yet been established. But the evidence is sufficiently adequate to say that it could be, and so it's worth giving patients the opportunity to have this early access to this potentially effective treatment. The additional requirement in the accelerated approval is that the company has to do a trial that will validate the relationship between the reduction in beta amyloid and clinical benefit to persons with Alzheimer's disease. And in the press release that the FDA put out on that day that I've already quoted from, they warned, if you will, if the trial fails to verify clinical benefit, the FDA may initiate proceedings to withdraw approval of the drug. So again, the drug was approved so that Biogen could market it, and they announced that they were going to begin marketing it and changed the name to Aduhelm. So the drug now had a brand name, Aduhelm. So that's how aducanumab became Aduhelm. Accelerated approval by FDA. And again, this meant the company could sell the drug, which they set out to do, and also that the company would have to do a clinical trial to validate that and verify the clinical benefit of the drug. Accelerated approval was a surprise to the field. The surprise was that prior to June 7th, discussions of amyloid beta lowered by aducanumab as a surrogate had not been discussed. In fact, at the November 2020 meeting, it had been raised by one of the advisory committee members, and the FDA dismissed the topic and said that that was not being considered. I will say, in fact, looking back at the transcript of the November meeting, FDA officials do talk about their statutory authority to exercise maximum flexibility in approval of the drug. And I think as now, in light of what we know now, they were saying that we're considering accelerated approval. Again, having said that, though, the discussion around the drug, around the approval, as well as Biogen's submission to the FDA was for what's called standard approval, that the drug is safe and effective. The documents the FDA released after the approval, as well as information that was found out by the press through its reporting, investigative reporting, would uncover that there were some differences at FDA over this decision. Namely, some at FDA wanted standard approval, safe and effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Others at the FDA, such as the Office of Biostatistics, did not recommend the drug be approved. They either standard or accelerated approval. And others at the FDA felt that accelerated approval was the appropriate way forward. So within FDA, there were some divisions about what the appropriate decision ought to be. After the decision, 3 members of that advisory committee resigned in disagreement with the decision and the process that FDA had followed, and felt that their services were no longer useful, and so they resigned. So that's how aducanumab became Aduhelm. I'd now like to talk about how Aduhelm unfolded in clinical practice. There are a couple just highlights I wanted to give to you that I think are helpful to just inform what's happened since then, and set the context for some of the context for the CMS proposal for coverage of evidence development, as well as the reactions to the CMS proposal. The first topic I wanted to talk about was the label for the drug. So the label describes the FDA written document that's called the drug's label. I remember one time an FDA person remarking, "We know no one reads the label, but we spend a lot of time working on the language." And the reason why they spend a lot of time working on the language in a back and forth dialogue with the drug's owner, the company, in this case Biogen, is because the label very much sets the parameters around how the drug can be used. So for example, the key opening line in the label is a section called indication. And indication describes the kinds of patients for which this drug can be prescribed. Translate this into a company's perspective from the marketing side, it's the kind of patients you can market the drug to. And the more a prescription deviates from the label, the more that would be considered off-label prescribing. From the perspective of an insurer, they look at the label to decide what are the kinds of patients that we're going to offer this drug to. And I will say the field in general, across a variety of views about the appropriateness of the decision FDA made about aducanumab, found that the label initially wrote a set of indications that were quite broad. The label stated that Aduhelm was indicated for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. What the label then did not go into any detail on were the severity of the Alzheimer's disease that the patient had to have, mild cognitive impairment or mild stage dementia, or the need to verify that they had elevated amyloid. In addition, the label has a section called contraindications, and this would describe individuals for whom a medical condition or another therapy they're on should be considered a contraindication, or at least a warning about the use of the drug. And the contraindication section of the FDA label simply stated none. And the field, many found this concerning because these engaged and emerged studies excluded people with certain diseases, particularly hypertension, and the use of certain medications, particularly medicines that thin blood, because one of the side effects, the risks of a drug like aducanumab is amyloid-related imaging abnormalities, which is a funky term that's usually abbreviated as ARIA, but it describes either small areas of edema, swelling, or small areas of bleeding or microhemorrhages in the brain, which, if left undetected and get worse, can cause a patient to be symptomatic and quite ill. And FDA would revise the label. In the weeks to follow the approval, FDA, in conjunction with Biogen, would rewrite the indication section to indicate that the drug was indicated for individuals with mild cognitive impairment or mild stage dementia, Alzheimer's disease. They would not add any requirement for amyloid imaging, and the contraindication section would remain none. I'll come back to the broad label when we review some of the criticisms of the CMS proposal. In the events that followed that approval of the drug, several healthcare systems declined to add the drug to the formulary, and this was rather notable. Several insurers declined to cover the drug as well, Blue Cross Blue Shield, for example, in Massachusetts and others. They argued that they did not think that the Aduhelm was reasonable and necessary, and therefore would not cover it. Alison Hoffman will talk more about this idea of reasonable and necessary, because it's a very critical sort of decision that an insurer needs to make when they decide whether they're going to cover a treatment. In the weeks to follow the FDA approval of the drug, journalists would uncover that the company, Biogen, and the officials at the FDA had meetings, and there was a concern that the meetings involved engagements and discussions that exceeded those that would typically be expected in the behavioral regulatory scientists at FDA with a company submitting an application. And the then acting FDA director, Janet Woodcock, would find that those interactions were sufficiently concerning that she would ask the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General to investigate. And in August of 2021, the OIG decided to open up a case to investigate the relationships between FDA employees and Biogen, and also concerns over scientific disputes within the FDA, the advisory committee's vote against the approval, and the use of the accelerated approval pathway. That OIG and Office of Inspector General investigation is ongoing. Biogen would submit the Engage and Emerge data to Japan and the European Medical Authority, both the sort of FDA equivalents, if you will, in those countries for approval, and both of those would decline to approve the drug. And then finally, Biogen announced that the price of the drug would be roughly about $56,000 per year per patient. Many, including the Alzheimer's Association, deemed that price unacceptable and demanded Biogen revisit it. And indeed, just last month, at the close of December of 2021, Biogen announced they were cutting the price of the drug from $56,000 a year per patient to $28,000. So in summary, Aduhelm has had a bit of a rough rollout since its approval in June of 2021. I'll conclude with one other event, and then I'll transition over to Alison Hoffman, which is that around about June, July, the CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, announced that they were going to now have an open call for people to comment on a series of questions that they posed about the drug to inform its decision about coverage. So Medicare was seeking views from America about their whether the drug was reasonable and necessary. Those 30 days of comments were gathered by Medicare, and Medicare went off and then reviewed them, as well as all the data about the drug, to issue what's called their coverage with evidence development decision. And with that, what I'm going to do now is turn over to my colleague, Alison Hoffman, to give an overview of Medicare coverage determinations. And then we'll come back to, I'll come back and I'll talk about the specifics of the proposal that Medicare issued last week. Alison, take it away.
Thanks, Jason. It's nice to be here with you all today. So let me talk a little bit about what happened when it shifts from the FDA over to CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. And just because the FDA has approved something doesn't necessarily mean that the federal government is going to pay for it. And so this is the next step in the tail where Jason left off, is that now CMS has to determine whether they're going to pay for it or not. Would you flip the slide? Do I have control? No, you have it. Thank you. Okay, so just as for those of you who are less familiar with how this whole process works, what is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS? CMS is a federal agency. They're under the Department of Health and Human Services, and they run the Medicare and Medicaid programs. When they run those programs, they're running them based on what Congress has told them they should do when they run those programs, and that's set forth in the Social Security Act, one title for Medicare, one title for Medicaid. CMS does a lot. So if you think about kind of all aspects of operations for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS puts out regulations, they put out guidance and rules that guide everything from the conditions of participation, when a facility can be part of these programs, they make payment for services under these programs, they determine what to pay for. And if people have violated those kinds of conditions, then then they're in charge of the enforcement of those violations as well. So they have a wide range of authority. This is just a little piece of the range of what they do. They're responsible for about a third of the U.S. population who has public health insurance through Medicare, Medicaid, the Children's Health Insurance Program. Jason, next slide. So recently, they've had to determine whether or not to cover Aduhelm. And when we say that something is covered by Medicare, typically that is completely non-controversial. So typically when something is medically effective, whether it be a healthcare service that a hospital or a doctor provides, whether it be a medical device, whether it be a drug, typically Medicare pays for it, and that process would be seamless. Occasionally, though, when there are new advances in healthcare, questions of whether Medicare will pay for it, whether CMS will pay for it, arise. And again, usually this kind of controversy doesn't reach the level of attention that we have in this case. So typically, what happens as new items and services are available, you see decisions percolating from the ground up. So there are, CMS at the federal level couldn't do everything on its own. So it has these regional, are called MACs, Medicare Administrative Contractors, and they make those decisions on the ground. And they consider, for example, if a claim is denied, they get appealed to the MACs. Sometimes they look at things on a claims by claims basis. Sometimes a MAC, one of those 12 MACs, issues something called a local coverage decision. And that would be a decision that would say, for example, we will cover Aduhelm in our region of the country, or we will not. And so that's typically how these kinds of payment decisions are made. Occasionally, though, CMS does consider at a national level whether to pay for something. When it does that, it does it under an authority called the National Coverage Decision, or NCD. And again, with drugs, it's very rare that you see CMS stepping into this kind of role. The criteria, you see it more often with things like medical devices. So the question that CMS has to try to answer in determining whether Medicare will pay for a drug or device is based again on the statute. They look back to the statute, and the statute says we'll pay for things that are, quote, reasonable and necessary. Well, what does that mean? And that's the big question. And there's nothing in writing, there's nothing in the statute. When CMS interprets a statute, they put something into regulations or guidance. There's nothing concrete in regulations or guidance defining what reasonable and necessary means. The Trump administration actually had issued a draft guidance to put a concrete definition to reasonable and necessary, and the Biden administration pulled it back because there are benefits to not defining in concrete terms what reasonable and necessary mean. But some of the factors that are considered and that have been considered are things like, and this won't surprise those of you who are following this decision because you've seen these factors talked about in the press releases and the conversations around it. Is it safe and effective, including the kinds of medical risks that Jason was just talking about? Is it experimental or investigational? Is it appropriate? And for appropriateness, they consider things like the duration of treatment or of services, the frequency, again, patient population sometimes. They don't explicitly consider costs, or they don't have to consider costs, but they sometimes do. They don't usually talk about costs as being the determining factor, but you have to know in a decision like this one that costs were in the back of their mind. So leading up to this decision, we saw people crunching numbers based on the cost, based on the initial quoted cost of $56,000 per year. And so imagine about 80% of the patients who are eligible for Aduhelm are Medicare beneficiaries. They're on the Medicare program for people who are age 65 and over. This should not be surprising, or people with disabilities. It would be covered under Part B of Medicare. Part B is the piece of Medicare that pays for outpatient services and items, including outpatient drugs. And Part B is mostly tax financed. About 72% of Part B is tax financed. About 20% is paid for through cost sharing by the beneficiaries in the program. So each time they went to get a treatment, they would pay for 20%. At an initial price of $56,000, one study said that if only 10% of the 6 million US patients with Alzheimer's received the drug, that overall drug spending would increase by 88%, would increase by 37 billion to 69 billion. If there were 30% uptake, it would be a 262% increase. And if you take that cost, that 262% increase, you spread it equally among the entire US population, if each one of us paid a share of it, it would cost each one of us $211 annually just to pay for Aduhelm, for 30% of the eligible Medicare population. So even at the discounted price, even if you consider a price half that, it would be more than a doubling of overall drug spending, and you know, it would have a tremendous impact on the Medicare program. So you can't. One has to imagine that that's in the backs of the regulators' minds as they're thinking through this decision. Jason. So when CMS was deciding whether to cover the drug or not, and when they're deciding whether to cover any item or service or not, they can answer it in several different ways. So you can, a national coverage determination can produce the following decisions. They could say, yes, we're just going to pay for it. No, we're not going to pay for it at all. They could decide to make no decision, in which case they leave the continued decisions on the ground to those MACs to on a case-by-case basis or through local coverage determinations to continue to kind of make policy in more of a grassroots way, or they could make a decision of coverage with evidence development, which is indeed what they did. So Jason will talk about more about what that means, but generally it's kind of a middle ground between the yes coverage and no coverage determinations. And what it means is that Medicare will pay for a drug under a CMS approved clinical study. And it provides access, although bounded access, while research continues. Once that decision is made, it puts in place some very important considerations about what exactly those studies are going to look like and what research gathering is going to look like. It requires well-organized efforts for data collection. We've seen efforts in the past where that have not been very well organized, or that have required too much data collection and have been extremely expensive. And this kind of decision is important as well, because either a yes or no decision, or even a decision, CED decision, will inform how private commercial insurers and others think about when and where to cover an item or service. So for example, had CMS said, yes, we're going to cover it across the board, it would have been put more pressure on private insurers to cover it across the board. Had they said no, you probably would have seen a larger number of private insurers not covering it all. With a decision like this, some may wait and they may start to track the evidence to see whether over time they're going to make decisions to pay for it or not. So with that, let me hand it back to Jason to talk a little bit about this particular decision and reactions to it.
Unmute. Great. All right. Well, good to be back. Let me just minimize. I'm on a laptop, so I have like scarce space here, moving little bits around. Okay. Now, so what I'm going to do now is review the CMS proposal, reactions to it, and next steps. And it is a proposal. open for comments for the next 30 days, less than 30 days, because the clock is ticking from last week. And then later in April, CMS will issue a final decision. What I'm going to do now, actually, if you click on this link, it will take you to the proposal. I'm just going to actually just go over to that. So you can go to this website here. I'm on the web right now, and I'm looking at the coverage, the monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease decision. There's a summary and there's a detailed memo as well, which is the entire decision. And it's there for you to read. The other thing, and I'll come back and show this to you again, is you can comment on it. If I clicked on that link, I would jump to a comments page where you can enter your name and other information and paste in your comments about this as well. So this is all publicly available. If you click into the coverage database, what you'll see is that, I'm going to take a risk and do that, is that CMS has a set of these coverage with evidence development. There we go, going on. And so here's the one for, this is comments, excuse me, for the amyloid one. I jumped to that, but I wanted to just show you that there's this list of other CED activities that are going on around a bunch of other things. And I can't seem to get to it, but this is, they have used this mechanism and are using this mechanism for treatments like Aduhelm in some sense, where there is uncertainties. And so let me begin with why CMS issued this proposal. So what I'm doing now is I'm quoting from Dr. Lee Fleischer, who is the CMS Chief Medical Officer and Director for the Center for Clinical Standards and Quality. And I'm just quoting from him here. He wrote, "The proposed national coverage determination is the result of robust evidence analysis conducted through a thorough review process that found that while there may be potential for promise with this treatment, there is also the potential for harms to patients. This harm may range from headaches, dizziness, and falls to other potentially serious complications such as brain bleeds. We believe that any appropriate assessment of patient health outcomes must weigh both harm and benefit before arriving at a final decision. Therefore, based on the public comments submitted previously and evidence CMS reviewed, the potential for harm and important questions that remain, we have determined that coverage with evidence development through clinical trials is the right decision for Medicare patients, clinicians, and caregivers, and we look forward to receiving feedback on the proposal." And I've showed you where you can go see the proposal. And now what I'd like to do is just walk through some of the sort of highlights of the proposal. So CMS focused on a question, and the question, and I'm just quoting here, and you can go read this yourself on the document I showed you online, is the evidence sufficient to conclude that the use of monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease improves health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries? So this is a very interesting question, because it's not about just Aduhelm, aducanumab. It's about the class of drugs called monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid. And you'll see in their report, if you look at it, that they reviewed all the evidence around monoclonal antibodies, drugs like aducanumab, donanemab, solanezumab, that have been tested against amyloid. And based on that evidentiary review, arrived at their decision. Now, the one drug that, of course, that was before them was the FDA-approved drug, namely aducanumab, being marketed by Biogen as Aduhelm. So this decision applies to all monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And you'll hear later that in the criticisms and critiques of the decision, that topic has been raised. So that was the question they focused on. And their answer was that they would cover FDA-approved monoclonal antibodies directed against amyloid for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease under coverage with evidence development, using randomized controlled trials that satisfy the coverage criteria and in trials supported by the NIH. So again, they're wording this in a general way, but of course they know, we know, and they talk about in the report, the only FDA-approved monoclonal antibody right now is Aduhelm. And so this is a report that's essentially a response to FDA's decision to approve Aduhelm. And now remember, as Alison pointed out, normally, typically, routinely, especially for drugs, but but not always. CMS coverage, Medicare coverage, follows FDA approval as day follows night, and just the one leads to the other. And the system that is sort of set up between these two agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services is, well, FDA says it's safe and effective, so that's probably reasonable and necessary. And Alison explained to you some of the details of what happens there. But remember, what happened here was FDA said this drug isn't safe and effective. It isn't. It might be, and we need Biogen to do another study to verify that. But under accelerated approval, we're going to allow the drug to be available for patients who are willing to take it. And again, the accelerated approval regulations are written for serious and life-threatening diseases for which there's no effective treatment. And certainly Alzheimer's is a serious and life-threatening disease for which there is no effective treatment. And so sort of you already see sort of baked into our system, our American healthcare system, a kind of contradiction or fault, if you will, a fault line, which is FDA has this ability under regulations to approve a drug that's not safe and effective, but might be, okay, for serious and life-threatening diseases. Meanwhile, CMS is charged with covering things that are reasonable and necessary, which typically means, well, did FDA say it was safe and effective? If they did, well, then we're good to go. You see the problem, you see the drama, you see the tension laid out in plainly here. Okay, so they did review the data then, and they decided that the data, I read to you Dr. Fleischer's summary and what their answer is, which is, frankly, essentially, in some sense, they agreed with FDA. More research is needed, because that's what FDA is requiring Biogen to do, is another study. Well, CMS is saying the same thing, and what they're saying is, if we're going to pay for it, CMS, Medicare, and therefore Medicaid, we're going to pay for it if the patient is receiving the drug in the context of a clinical trial. So they describe in great detail in their proposed coverage with evidence development what that trial should look like. And I won't exhaust the details, except that some of the highlights here, that this trial must be designed to answer the question, does the use of the monoclonal antibody directed against the amyloid result in a statistically significant and clinically meaningful difference in decline in cognition and function? And the operative word here is clinically meaningful. Namely, the FDA's decision says the drug hasn't been shown to have clinically meaningful benefit. It has the potential to. That's why we're using accelerated approval. CMS is saying, no, we need to see clinically meaningful difference, and so we'll pay for people in studies that are designed to show whether there's clinically meaningful difference. Also, the trial must be able to understand the adverse events associated with the use of the antibody for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, so gathering more safety data. And the points raised here are, back to that FDA label, it mentions the risks of ARIA and whatnot. It talks about, lists out the risks of ARIA, and what CMS wants is more data in a more real-world population of people with Alzheimer's disease who have hypertension and other diseases, how the drug would perform in them. The patient must have mild cognitive impairment or mild stage AD dementia, and they must have evidence of elevated amyloid by a PET scan or other techniques. And CMS says they'll cover the cost of the amyloid PET scan needed to verify that someone has elevated amyloid. So very much matches the ENGAGE and the eMERGE studies that Biogen have. The trial, the study must include a diversity of patients that are representative of the national population diagnosed with AD. They point out, CMS points out that the diversity of patients with AD reflects a diversity of race, ethnicity, comorbidities, and the trial should capture that diversity as well. And finally, they're clear that the design needs to be a multi-center randomized controlled trial, if you will, sort of phase 3 design. So in some sense, they're saying we'd like to see another ENGAGE and eMERGE, albeit with a more representative population than the population that was studied in ENGAGE and eMERGE. And both of those studies were fairly homogeneous, at least by categories of race and ethnicity and education, namely predominantly people who self-identified as white and with an education of high school to college education. So the rationale for this decision was that some of the monoclonal antibodies have been studied and published, as well as the FDA market authorized aducanumab, do effectively clear amyloid plaques. And they agreed with FDA that that is encouraging. CMS went on to say, we also agree that the clinical benefits of clearance of amyloid is uncertain, and no trial has convincingly demonstrated a clinically meaningful improvement in health outcomes. And finally, that the risks of amyloid-related imaging abnormalities together create a situation where there's change in a biomarker, uncertain benefit to patients, a clear documented risk, and hence the need for more study. So that's the proposal. So what have been the reactions to the proposal? So let me go through those. First, one reaction has been is that this undermines FDA's authority. FDA made a decision. They had the statutory ability to make a decision for accelerated approval. And FDA officials in the November 2020 advisory committee meeting stated that very clearly. But CMS has, as Alison Hoffman has laid out, also has authority to do just what they did. So both are using their authorities. I used the word before, a fault in the system. You could argue now the fault is a widening chasm in the system where sort of two parts of the same agency or a department in the federal government had the ability to do two very different things. The argument has been made that it stifles innovation, not just because this guidance covers not just aducanumab, but all monoclonal antibodies. Arguably, I think it will stifle innovation in diagnostics because the wide use of diagnostic tests for amyloid certainly will not be as widely used. It will only be in the context of people in a trial. I think the jury's out about therapeutics because if CMS hadn't issued this decision and just said we're going to cover these drugs, all those failed amyloid therapies could come back for approval, and because of the desire of those people who developed them to recover their sunk costs. And the history with innovation with respect to FDA approval is mixed. Sometimes an FDA approval does lead to great innovation in the field, and sometimes it doesn't. So I think it's a mixed question. The real main criticism, though, that I think that has occupied a lot of attention is that this decision limits access to patients. And it does. It limits access only to patients who enroll in a clinical trial. And that limiting of access will worsen health inequities. And there's a quote from Harry Johns, the chief executive officer of the Alzheimer's Association. He said, with the approach proposed by CMS, access to treatments would now only be available to a privileged few, those with access to research institutions, exacerbating and creating further health inequities. And this has been a point that has been championed by the Alzheimer's Association and Us Against Alzheimer's and other groups, this issue of inequity. And there certainly are equity issues here, but they're not unique to this drug or this decision. Issues around who has access to clinical trials based on their ability to get to a trial center, take the time off to go to a trial, be a study partner for someone, have been longstanding issues in the field. Certainly this proposal by CMS foregrounds what has been a longstanding problem of inequities in access to clinical trials. I think CMS found itself in a bind. Namely, we've been handed a drug that many other insurers, the regional insurers, have already said we don't want to pay for. That many healthcare systems have said we're not going to put it on the formulary. And it just wasn't the kind of decision that described a drug that clearly there's a willingness to pay in the marketplace. And so one can, I think, see that they were caught in this bind of we need to give some access to the drug, but get the kind of data that we need to allow people to make a decision as to whether this drug is safe and effective. And so that's the situation that we're in right now. The next steps are that CMS will receive public comments for 30 days after 11 January. So sometime in mid-February, that will close. And you can go to the public comments site. Here's the link for it. I already showed it to you. But if you click on the link here, you'll see monoclonal antibodies for all, and you have to make sure you go to the right date for it. Well, here's where you can submit your comment to it. And you can also look at other people's comments here by viewing public comments. And you can see here, you have to pick the date range. So those were the comments that were gathered over the summer. This is the comments that are being gathered now. And you can see here, there's been a total of 131 comments, 207 comments have come in so far. That's a lot of comments for one of these things. And you can see them all here and read them. And you too can add your comment about this proposed proposal by CMS. We've run long, but it's a complicated story, and I think it's one that we feel our community needs to know in full detail. Let's open it now for questions. Terry Casey.
Yeah, thank you both so much. We've gotten a lot of really positive feedback about how thorough both of your presentations were. I guess the most frequent question was about the clinical trial. What role would you hope to see Penn Memory Center play in that clinical trial?
Yeah, and pardon me if I'm sitting here looking like I'm surfing the web. I'm not. I'm just trying to get rid of my screen share. I got to get that black line thing that goes on there. I'll just keep it the way it is. So in principle, the Penn Memory Center is keenly interested in this clinical trial. We have been a site for the Biogen studies of aducanumab. I remain enthusiastic about studying this drug. I think it should be given out to a patient after they sign a research-informed consent form, not after they receive a prescription. This drug may work, but further research is needed. As far as the trial, we would need to see the study, the actual protocol, look at it, and my colleagues, particularly Dr. Vaishnavi and Dr. Wolk, and I would go over, does it fit for us, is it a fit? But in principle, we are very enthusiastic about being a site for further studies of aducanumab for the treatment of Alzheimer's. Very enthusiastic.
And has Penn Medicine had an overall determination about prescribing Aduhelm regardless of the decision, or is it awaiting a final?
It's awaiting the final April decision by CMS.
Great. And what is the timeline? Could you repeat if there's a timeline for the trial? What would we be looking at?
Well, there's at least two timelines at work here. So Biogen about a month ago announced that they were going to be putting out the protocol for their FDA mandated study to determine whether the drug, to validate whether the drug is clinically beneficial. And sometime in the spring of this year, we'll see that trial. CMS is simply saying, if you have a trial and it meets our criteria, we're willing to cover the cost of the drug and the scan, and we'd like to see the data to decide whether we were now going to cover the drug for care. So they, for example, Biogen may say, how about our study? Does that meet your criteria? And CMS could say, yeah, it does. Others could come forth with a study. So I think there's a conversation to unfold in the coming 6 months. I'm putting that as an arbitrary number with, well, Biogen needs to do a study. CMS wants to see a study done. Could their study be the study that would meet CMS's criteria for coverage of evidence development? That I think will be the events that will unfold in the coming 6 months or so.
We had a couple of comments about the kind of unequal access to research, and you answered a few of those questions out of earlier on. But how will PMC work to address that diversity that is required for the trial?
Well, we have and will continue the work we've done. Terry's and Sharnita Midget lead our outreach efforts as part of our outreach recruitment and education engagement core, which is part of our Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And we will work with our community partners to raise awareness of this study. We'll pay attention to a very important fact, which is that being in research is labor, it's work, it is work. And how well are we compensating people for that work, their time and their effort? We'd be keen to think about a study that has an inventive design that allows remote gathering of data rather than having to come in all the time to give data. Certainly the events of the last horrible 24 months have shown us that we can conduct medicine remotely. We'd be interested in a study that has flexibility in the hours with which data that need to be gathered in person can be gathered, such as weekend times. We don't usually do that at the Memory Center, but we'd be interested in that. So these are the issues of the work of being in research to address some of the challenges of the work of being in research we're quite keen to. Let me remind you, These challenges in clinical research in terms of the representative population have existed across Alzheimer's trials since the cholinesterase inhibitor era, as well as trials across a variety of disease categories. I will say, as an editorial comment, I think it's challenging to say that this drug, given its risks and uncertainties, is the route for America to solve the inequities in diagnosis and care of persons with Alzheimer's disease. It strikes me as a very indirect method to address the disparities in care, such as getting a diagnosis and getting access to long-term care services and supports. I think that sentiment that it does is a sentiment that reflects how we are overly reliant on pharmaceuticals as a way to innovate and improve the quality of care in American healthcare. We could have addressed the inequities of diagnosis and access to treatment for Alzheimer's disease over the last 30 years by expanding the size and scope of memory centers, but as a society, we just haven't chosen to do that.
You could
Alison,
read,
go ahead.
yeah, you could read, Jason, that there's a kind of a special imperative to think about issues of diversity once the government is paying for the trials, right? Because that's essentially what this decision does.
That's a good point.
It says instead of Biogen continuing to, test the effectiveness of its own drug, the federal government is going to do. I mean, and some people think that's exactly what Biogen hoped out of this decision, was a CED where Medicare would then subsidize the cost of continued trials, right? Which then, it's not the answer to
inequities
in the healthcare system by any stretch of the imagination, but it makes it even greater of an imperative for trials going forward to think about those kinds of inequities.
Yeah, it's one thing for a private actor to say, we ran our study, this is who we enrolled, unless there are medical reasons around, the presentation of disease, et cetera. Matters of diversity that's not in our corporate interest, but I think matters of diversity are in the public interest, and Medicare is the public interest.
We're getting a kind of a slew of questions now. So one thing I'll say, just watching the clock as well, is if we can't address any of these questions today, we'll make sure that we wrap them all up in our coverage of the event and a Q&A, and share it with, bring in any other voices that are necessary. So please feel free.
Yeah, I don't want to put Alison on the spot, but I can go over a little bit beyond time. Alison was committed up to 5, and so please, Alison, just go. Okay, keep on going, Terry.
There's one question about when the 30 days are up, and that looks like that is on February 10th.
Yep, February 10th, 2022. That's the deadline for getting your comment in.
There was a question about the cost. There was a number of people were shocked by the figures that Alison was throwing out there. Does either CMS or FDA have any power to force Biogen to adjust the price?
So through the process of considering coverage, some commentators thought that CMS would do exactly that, is lean on Biogen, and they might have. We don't know why Biogen halved the price when they did, right? That may have been a conversation back and forth. At this point, though, CMS doesn't have the ability to do so. Through kind of its official processes for determining how to pay for drugs. It's, when in the so at this point, it's unlikely that price point that Biogen has named at this point is going to change, unless it kind of happens through an informal process behind the scenes. It's expensive, and it's especially expensive for something where kind of the endpoint efficacy is not known. There are treatments where, for example, you're known to cure something that is quite expensive and serious, and then a price point like like 56,000 or 28,000 may not be shocking, but it's a high price point for something that's still being tested.
Thank you. And there was a question just for clarification. If a physician is prescribing and you have the means, you could pay privately for Aduhelm.
That's correct. Yeah, in principle, absolutely. Yeah.
So a couple questions about the trial design. Could you clarify when you talk about the trial you envision? Is that what you would hope to see as a national standard, or is Penn Memory Center looking to design its own trial that would fit the bill?
So we are not, I can speak for myself, don't have in my playbook, excuse me, that's a funky word, I didn't mean to say that. I don't have a plan to design a trial, and I don't think my colleagues do. So we're not planning our own trial. We though certainly are interested in the trials that could be done. I mentioned already, Biogen has to do a trial, and they may well decide that the trial that they're going to do, mandated by the accelerated approval that they receive from FDA, will meet the criteria for the CMS trial. And we would be very keen to see that protocol and be a site for that. Again, we'd have to see the protocol and go through it and make sure we can do it. But in principle, we would be very interested in that trial.
And I suppose this really could be applied to any clinical trial, but the question of if a research participant is taking a chance that they're receiving the drug or a placebo, sort of what's the pitch for convincing someone to participate in the trial if they could potentially go out and pay cash?
Yeah, let me answer that. I was going to point out something else. I think it's you have to decide. Do you share the uncertainty that I have, me, Jason Karlawish, Dr. Karlawish, which is, this drug might work. There's signals of a change in a pathophysiologic marker. There are hints based on sub-analyses of the data that engage in emerge trials that it may translate to clinical benefit. But the quality of that data, the certainty of it, I share the view of the FDA statistical report. It just wasn't good enough to meet the criteria to be safe and effective. And in that sense, FDA agreed. And I just don't think it meets the criteria for accelerated approval. Accelerated approval wasn't designed as sort of a compromise decision. Yeah, obviously, FDA, key people at FDA didn't share my view. Anyway, if you share that uncertainty, I think the right place to be, the right place to be is a clinical trial, which is, you're right, this may work, it may not. And the reason why a clinical trial is the right place to be is you're going to get drug or placebo in a way that's monitored, controlled, studied, along with thousands of other people. And the safety of the drug will be monitored. Your safety will be monitored. Your well-being will be monitored. Again, that's a personal decision. So individuals say, I have no interest in taking part in that activity. But to me, there is a time when actually research in principle is the right place to be, unless you personally don't want to be in it. And that is, I think, the situation with this drug right now. The challenge I was raising is if there's a copay for the drug, we have to figure out how people are going to pay a copay for what could be a placebo. They obviously won't know they're getting placebo, but I think that's a detail that needs to be ironed out. When you're randomized to drug or placebo and you're paying a copay on it, well, maybe they'll cover the copay. That's something I think can be sorted out. I don't view that as a deal breaker. But that does emerge as sort of a challenge about how you do a trial in clinical practice if people are paying copays.
Great. Well, that takes us right to 5 o'clock. Are there any kind of closing arguments from either Jason or Alison?
Alison, any closing remarks, thoughts?
Just continue to watch with interest. I don't think this is the end of this story.
It isn't. This is the middle of a saga, and an unfortunate saga. It didn't have to turn out this way. It is a story of politics, and I don't mean politics in a crude way. I mean politics simply as the exercise of power and persuasion. That's what politics is. And I will say the last several months have been a lot more power than persuasion. I would hope that this CMS proposal initiates power and persuasion going on. And it is encouraging that CMS wants comments. They asked for them in the summer. They're asking for them now. Please give them your comments. They read them. They made very clear in their proposal. We read the comments we got in the summer. We'll read the comments we get now. So please take the time to look at the proposal, and we'll have those links up for you. And if you desire, take the time to comment about what you think about it.
All right, thank you so much. This recording will be available in our Insight this Sunday. Again, the link for subscribing is in the chat, but it's also available on PennMemoryCenter.org. Or the same way that you have found out about this event, you can reply to that email and that will come back to me. If you have any additional questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out. We'll update the Q&A on the Aduhelm page that was shared in the chat earlier. But thank you again to Jason and Alison, and thank you so much for everyone for sticking around this long. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.